Imagine you are standing at the edge of a lake. The year, by tradition, is 1325. Around you, the air is thick with the smell of fresh water and reed grass. You are tired, hungry, and afraid. Your people have been walking for over 200 years, searching for a sign, a promise made by a god. And then, in the middle of the lake, on a small island of rock and earth, you see it, an eagle, sitting on a cactus, holding a serpent in its beak. Your god has spoken, you have arrived. And here, in this impossible place, surrounded by water, your people will build one of the greatest cities the Americas would ever see. This is the story of the Aztecs, a people of fire, devotion, and extraordinary imagination. A civilization that looked at the stars and found meaning, that built floating gardens in the middle of a lake, that asked the hardest questions human beings can ask. Who are we, and why are we here? You may think you already know this story. Conquest, gold, the end. But the Aztecs were so much more than their ending. And understanding what they built, what they believed, and what was taken from them might just change how you see your own world. Welcome to English Through Great Stories. Chapter 1, A People Without a Home. Every great civilization begins with a story. Not just a history, a story. Something that answers the deepest question a people can ask. Who are we, and why are we here? For the Aztecs, that story began with a god named Huitzilopochtli. He was the god of the sun and of war. He was their protector, their guide, and their demanding father. The people who would become the Aztecs called themselves the Mexica. In the early centuries of the second millennium, they were wanderers, a small, poor tribe with no land, no city, and no power. Other groups looked down on them. They had almost nothing, but they had a god who had made them a promise. When they finally found their sign and settled on the island in the lake, the hard work was only beginning. The neighboring peoples of the Valley of Mexico did not welcome them. They were seen as rough outsiders with little to offer. For many years, the Mexica lived under the shadow of more powerful groups, paying tribute to their neighbors and struggling to be taken seriously. But the Mexica were patient, and they were learning. They hired themselves out as soldiers to the stronger city-states around them. They formed alliances through careful marriages between noble families. They watched how power worked in central Mexico, and they began to use what they saw. Slowly, painfully, over generations, they built the relationships and the reputation that would allow them to rise. The outsiders who had once been despised were beginning to be noticed and feared. Think about what that moment must have meant. 200 years of suffering suddenly given meaning. All that pain, all those generations of uncertainty, suddenly part of a divine plan. This is something deeply human. We all look for a sign. We all hope that our struggles are leading somewhere. The Aztecs turned that hope into a city. They called it Tenochtitlán, and it would become one of the wonders of the ancient world. Chapter 2, A City on the Water. There was one enormous problem with the island in the lake. It was tiny, it was swampy, it had very little fresh water. Building a city there would require an almost impossible level of engineering, creativity, and determination. So the Aztecs did something remarkable. They built new land. They created raised platforms of earth and vegetation in the shallow parts of the lake, held together by the roots of plants and anchored to the lakebed. These floating gardens, called chinampas, were extraordinarily productive. The rich mud from the lake bottom fertilized the crops. The water surrounding each garden kept them moist. The Aztecs grew corn, beans, tomatoes, chili peppers, and flowers in abundance. Tenochtitlan was not just surviving on its island, it was thriving. Within a century, it had become one of the largest cities on Earth. At its peak, it may have held 200,000 people or more. When the Spanish conquistador Hernán Cortés and his soldiers first saw Tenochtitlan in 1519, they were stunned. One of his soldiers, Bernal Diaz del Castillo, later wrote that they thought they were dreaming. Great temples rose above the lake. Causeways, long stone roads crossing the water, connected the island to the shore. Aqueducts carried fresh water into the city. Canals ran between the buildings like streets. It looked, he said, like something out of a fairy tale. It was larger than any city in Spain. It was larger than London at that time. The Aztecs had taken an impossible island and turned it into a wonder. But to understand what that city truly was, what gave it its soul, we have to go deeper. We have to understand what the Aztecs believed about the universe itself. Chapter 3. An Empire of Tribute. The Mexica did not rise alone. In the early 15th century, they formed a powerful coalition known as the Triple Alliance. Tenochtitlan joined forces with the neighboring cities of Texcoco and Tlaxcalans. Together, these three powers defeated the dominant force of the region, the Tepanec of Azcapotzalco, who had long kept the Mexica under their control. It was a moment of stunning reversal. The people who had once paid tribute to their neighbors were now the most powerful force in central Mexico. The Mexica used military skill, but they also used something equally powerful, political intelligence. They arranged marriages between royal families. They rewarded loyalty. They built networks of obligation that stretched across the valley and beyond. Within a few generations, the Triple Alliance controlled vast territories stretching from coast to coast across central Mexico. The empire they built did not work like later European empires. The Mexica did not always destroy the cities they defeated or replace their rulers. Instead, conquered cities were allowed to keep their local leaders and their local customs on one condition. They had to send regular payments to Tenochtitlan. These payments were called tribute. Goods flowed into the capital from every direction: cotton, feathers, cacao, jade, gold, food, and sometimes people. The tribute lists that survive show just how vast and efficient this system was. Tenochtitlan grew rich and powerful on what the empire delivered to its doorstep. But the system created a deep tension. Conquered peoples resented the demands. Year after year, they sent their resources to a capital that grew ever more magnificent, while their own communities bore the cost. That resentment simmered for decades, and when strangers arrived from the east, many of these subject peoples would see in them not a threat, but an opportunity. Chapter 4. The Fifth Son. To be Aztec was to live with a profound sense of fragility. Not personal fragility, the fragility of existence itself. The Aztecs believed that the world had already been created and destroyed 4 times before. Each age was called a sun, and each one had ended in catastrophe. The first sun was destroyed by a jaguar, the second by wind, the third by rain of fire, the fourth by flood. And the Aztecs knew that they were living in the fifth sun, the fifth and present age of the world. This age too would end. The question was not if, the question was when. And crucially, how could human beings help sustain the order of the present world? This belief shaped everything, every ritual, every sacrifice, every war, every prayer. It was not fear of the future, it was a deep, serious responsibility to the present. But the sun needed to keep moving, and to keep moving it needed continued nourishment. It needed blood, the most sacred substance in the universe, the liquid of life itself. This was the logic behind human sacrifice. It was not cruelty for the sake of cruelty. To the Aztecs, it was a profound and terrible duty. The gods had sacrificed themselves so the world could exist. Human beings owed a debt that had to be repaid. Understanding this sacred logic does not remove the terror or the suffering of those who were sacrificed. It helps us understand why the practice existed without asking us to approve of it. And it is important to remember that human sacrifice was the most dramatic and visible part of a much wider sacred world. Most daily religious practice looked very different. It involved burning incense, offering flowers, playing music, fasting, dancing, and making food offerings to the gods. Farmers celebrated the changing seasons with great agricultural festivals. Individuals practiced personal bloodletting as a form of devotion, a way of giving something of themselves to the divine. Aztec religious life was rich, varied, and deeply woven into every aspect of daily existence. Chapter 5: The Mother of Gods. At the heart of Aztec spiritual life was not only Huitzilopochtli, the god of war and the sun. There were hundreds of deities, gods of rain, corn, death, fertility, wisdom, and wind. But one figure stands apart from all others in her raw, unsettling power. Her name was Cuauhtémoc, and she was the mother of the gods. Her name means she of the serpent skirt. Her great stone statue, discovered under Mexico City in 1790, is one of the most astonishing works of art ever created. It stands nearly 3 meters tall. She has no head. In its place, 2 serpents rise and face each other, their open mouths meeting to form a single terrifying face. Her necklace is made of human hands and hearts, with a skull at the center. Her skirt writhes with living snakes. Her feet are giant claws. The story of Cuauhtémoc and her son Huitzilopochtli is remarkable. She was already the mother of 400 children when, one day while sweeping a temple, a ball of feathers fell from the sky and touched her body. She became pregnant. Her other children, furious at what they saw as a disgrace, decided to kill her. But the child inside her spoke to her, comforting her, promising to protect her. And the moment they attacked, Huitzilopochtli was born, fully armed, fully armored. He defeated them in a violent battle, and Cuauhtémoc fell from the sacred mountain. This myth described the sun rising every morning, born in battle, defeating the darkness and the stars. But it also described something more intimate, the idea that life arrives through vulnerability, that new beginnings are often born out of conflict, that even in the most difficult moments, something inside us can speak words of courage. The Aztecs preserved their deepest wisdom not only in painted books, but also in rituals, poetry, and stories passed from one generation to the next, stories that lived in the bones. Chapter 6: The Shape of Society. The city of Tenochtitlan was not only a spiritual center, it was a living, breathing society, complex, organized, and dynamic. At the top stood the Tlatoani, the great speaker, the ruler. This was not simply a king. The Tlatoani was also a religious figure, a military commander, and a symbol of the connection between the human and divine worlds. He was elected, chosen from among the noble families by a council of elders. Below the ruler were the nobles, the pipiltin, who held positions of power in government, religion, and the military. Then came the warriors. In Aztec society, military achievement was one of the most honored paths a man could follow. A warrior proved his worth not by killing enemies, but by capturing them alive for sacrifice. The more captives a warrior took, the higher his status rose. The most elite warriors were the eagle warriors and the jaguar warriors, named for the fierce animals they embodied. Then there were the priests, perhaps the most educated class of all. They kept the calendars, maintained the temples, interpreted omens, and oversaw all the great rituals. They studied astronomy, medicine, history, and philosophy. The training for a priest began in childhood at a special school called the Colmecac, where students were expected to live lives of discipline, fasting, and deep learning. Knowledge for the Aztecs was sacred, and those who possessed it carried a great responsibility. At the foundation of everything were the farmers, the craftspeople, the laborers, the Masahuatin. They worked the chinampas, built the temples, and fed the city. They paid tribute to the nobles, served in the military, and raised the next generation. Their lives were hard, but they were not without dignity. Formal education was unusually widespread and highly organized. Children from different social classes received training, although the schools they attended and the lives prepared for them were not the same. Chapter 7: The Great Marketplace. On the northern edge of the island stood a sister city, Tlatelolco, and at its heart was something that left every visitor breathless: the Great Market. It was said that 60,000 people came to buy and sell there every day. Think about that number, 60,000 in one place, at a time when most European cities had populations of just a few thousand people. This was not a market, it was a city within a city. When Hernán Cortés's soldiers walked through Tlatelolco's market, they could not believe what they saw. There were separate sections for every kind of good imaginable. One area sold food: corn tortillas, tamales, roasted meats, fish, honey, and chocolate. Yes, chocolate, which the Aztecs had been drinking for centuries before it ever reached Europe. Another area sold cloth, brilliantly dyed cotton and featherwork so delicate it looked like painting. There were areas for gold jewelry, for medicinal plants, for pottery and obsidian pools, for live animals, for slaves. There were barbers who cut hair at the edge of the market. The market was carefully organized. Specially appointed officials checked measurements, prevented fraud, and resolved disputes between buyers and sellers. Cacao beans were used as currency. The whole place operated with a sophistication that astonished soldiers who had seen the markets of Madrid, Seville, and Rome. Bernal Diaz del Castillo, who had traveled much of Europe, wrote simply, "We had never seen such a thing before." The market of Tlatelolco was not just a place of commerce. It was a place where the entire empire met. Traders came from faraway coasts and mountain valleys. Languages mixed, ideas moved. Goods that originated hundreds of kilometers away, seashells, tropical feathers, precious stones, passed from hand to hand in the noise and color and life of that extraordinary square. Chapter 8. The Architecture of Time. The Aztecs did not just live in space, they lived intensely and deliberately in time. They were among the greatest timekeepers in human history, and their understanding of time was not simply practical, it was sacred. Every moment had meaning, every day had a name, a personality, and a destiny. Time was alive, time was divine, and it was the priests who knew how to read it. The Aztecs used two interlocking calendars. The first was the Xiopowali, the solar calendar of 365 days. It was divided into 18 months of 20 days each, with 5 extra days at the end. Days considered dangerous and unlucky, a time when normal life paused and people stayed close to home. This calendar governed agriculture, festivals, and the great cycles of the natural world. It told farmers when to plant, when to harvest, when the rains would come. The second was the Tonalpowali, the sacred calendar of 260 days. Each day had a name, a number, and a spiritual character. Priests used it to guide rituals, interpret signs, and understand the destiny of individuals. A child's birth date in the Tonalpowali shaped expectations for their entire life. Every 52 years, the two calendars completed a full cycle together and returned to their starting point. This was an enormously significant moment, the end of one great cycle and the beginning of another. The Aztecs called it the binding of years. And at the end of each 52-year cycle, they faced the ultimate uncertainty. Would the fifth sun survive? Would the world continue? On the last night, all fires were extinguished across the empire. People waited in darkness. Priests climbed to a hilltop and watched the sky. If the stars continued their movement, if the Pleiades rose as they should, the world would survive another 52 years. A new fire would be lit on the chest of a sacrificial offering, and runners would carry torches across the empire, relighting every hearth. Imagine the relief, imagine the joy. The world had survived, life could continue. Every 52 years, the Aztecs experienced the profound relief of simply being alive. Chapter 9. Flower and Song. There is something about the Aztecs that is almost never mentioned in popular histories, something that makes them feel suddenly close, suddenly familiar, suddenly human. They loved poetry. Not just as entertainment, they believed poetry was the closest a human being could come to truth. They called it Inxochitl, Incuicatl, meaning flower and song, and they believed it was the language of the divine. Aztec philosophers asked questions that still ring with power today. Is anything true, or are all things merely a dream? One of their great poet-philosophers, Nezahualcóyotl, the king of the nearby city of Texcoco, wrote verses that have survived the centuries. A poem traditionally attributed to him says, "Even jade will shatter, even gold will break, even quetzal feathers will wither. Nothing on earth lasts forever." That is not the voice of a bloodthirsty empire. That is the voice of a human being staring honestly at mortality. Poetry was performed publicly, sung with drums and flutes at great gatherings. Schools taught students not only military training and religious knowledge, but also how to compose verse and sing with skill. Even young children learned songs. The Aztecs believed that a society without beauty was incomplete, that art was not a luxury but a necessity, that the human spirit needed flower and song the way the body needed food. In this, they speak to us directly across 5 centuries. Chapter 10. The Strangers from the East. In the year 1519, something unprecedented happened. Ships appeared on the eastern horizon of the Gulf of Mexico. Strange men climbed onto the shore, men wearing metal armor, carrying metal weapons, riding enormous animals that no one in this part of the world had ever seen. They came with horses, with guns, and with a flag bearing the insignia of a distant king. Their leader's name was Hernán Cortés. Cortés was a Spanish soldier of fortune, ambitious, brilliant, ruthless, and deeply complex. He had no official permission from the Spanish crown for this expedition. He had ordered most of his ships disabled and sunk on the coast, removing his men's easiest path of retreat. He was going forward, whatever the cost. And behind the expanding Spanish invasion came something far more destructive than guns or horses. Diseases from the Old World, against which the people of Mexico had no inherited immunity. Among the most important figures in the early months of the Spanish expedition was a young Nahua woman known today as Malintzin, also called Malinche or Doña Marina by the Spanish. She had been born into a noble family and sold into slavery as a child. By the time she encountered the Spanish, she spoke both Nahuatl and Mayan languages, and she learned Spanish with remarkable speed. She became Cortés's primary interpreter and one of his most important strategic advisors. Without her ability to communicate across languages and cultures, the negotiation and alliance building that followed would have been nearly impossible. Malintzin is one of the most debated figures in Mexican history. Some see her as a traitor who helped foreign invaders destroy her own people. Others see her as a survivor, a woman with no real power of her own, doing what she could in an impossible situation. Her story reminds us that the conquest was not a simple story of one group defeating another. It was a world of individuals making difficult choices under extreme pressure. The ruler of the Mexica at this time was Moctezuma II, sometimes written as Montezuma. He was a man of extraordinary intelligence and political skill. When news of the strangers reached him, he did not send soldiers immediately. He sent priests and observers. He needed information. The strangers arrived with unfamiliar weapons, unknown animals, and an unclear purpose. Alliances among the peoples of the region were already shifting in unpredictable ways. Moctezuma could not be certain who these men were, what they wanted, or how his own subject peoples might react to an open confrontation near the city. Moctezuma sent gifts, extraordinary gifts of gold, jade, and featherwork, hoping to honor the visitors and perhaps persuade them to leave. Instead, the gifts had the opposite effect. Cortés saw the gold and was inflamed with desire. He marched inland, and as he traveled, something remarkable happened. City after city, peoples who had been conquered by the Aztecs, who resented the heavy tribute and the constant demand for captives, chose to join Cortés against their overlord. The Tlaxcalans were the most important of these allies. They were fierce warriors who had long resisted Mexican domination. After fierce fighting, Tlaxcalan leaders chose negotiation over continued conflict. They were not conquered. They made a calculated political decision. They saw in Cortés a dangerous outsider, but also a potential weapon against their most powerful regional enemy, the Mexica. Their alliance was driven by a long and bitter rivalry with the Mexica, not admiration for the Spanish. And with their knowledge of the land, their warriors, and their deep understanding of regional politics, they became essential. The conquest of the Aztec Empire was not simply a story of Europeans defeating indigenous peoples. It was a story of alliances, rivalries, and betrayal, far more complicated than any simple narrative suggests. Chapter 11. The Night Tenochtitlan Fought Back. In November 1519, Cortés and his army, now swollen with thousands of Tlaxcalan warriors, arrived at the causeway leading to Tenochtitlan. Moctezuma came out to meet them in person, carried on a golden litter, dressed in the most magnificent garments, attended by hundreds of nobles. It was one of the strangest and most consequential meetings in the history of the world. Two men, two worlds, face to face. Cortés was invited into the city. The Spanish soldiers walked through its streets in a state of stupefied wonder. But Cortés was calculating. Within days, in a bold and violent act, he took Moctezuma prisoner, holding the ruler hostage in his own palace, effectively paralyzing the Aztec government. For months, an uneasy and terrible tension held the city in its grip. Then, in Cortés's absence, one of his officers ordered a massacre during a sacred festival. The city erupted. Moctezuma died. The exact circumstances remain disputed to this day. Some said the Spanish killed him. Others said his own people, furious at his submission, stoned him. A new ruler was chosen, and on the night of June 30th, 1520, the Aztecs launched a massive attack. Cortés and his soldiers tried to flee across the causeways in the darkness and rain. They were attacked from all sides, from boats in the lake, from the bridges, from the rooftops. Hundreds of Spanish soldiers died that night. Some drowned while carrying stolen gold they refused to abandon. Thousands of Tlaxcalan warriors died with them. It became known as La Noche Triste, the Night of Sorrow. Cortés himself survived. It is said he sat under a tree on the shore and wept. Whether those were tears of grief or simply exhaustion, we cannot know. But the Aztecs had won that night. Their city still stood. Their gods still watched. But the victory would not last. Even as Tenochtitlan celebrated driving the Spanish from its streets, an invisible enemy was already moving. Smallpox, carried into Mexico through the expanding Spanish expedition, spread with terrifying speed through a population that had no immunity to it. It killed people by the tens of thousands. It killed the new ruler, Cuauhtémoc, within months. It overwhelmed the temples, the homes, the chinampas. A city of 200,000 people found itself facing an enemy against which no warrior, no prayer, no sacrifice could offer protection. In the spring of 1521, Cortés returned, this time with a far larger force of Spanish soldiers and an enormous army of indigenous allies. He began a systematic siege of the city. He cut off the aqueducts. He destroyed the causeways. He attacked from boats on the lake. For 80 days, Tenochtitlan fought back. Block by block, temple by temple, the great city was torn apart. The Aztec warriors, weakened by disease and hunger, fought with everything they had. The last Aztec ruler was a young man named Cuauhtémoc. His name means descending eagle. He was 25 years old. He directed the defense of his city with extraordinary courage. But on August 13th, 1521, his canoe was intercepted trying to escape across the lake. He was captured. The city fell silent. The island that had once held one of the greatest cities in the Americas was a ruin. The causeways were broken, the temples were toppled, the water ran dark. Chapter 12. What was lost? When Tenochtitlan fell, the destruction did not stop with the fighting. The Spanish systematically dismantled the temples and used their stones to build a new city, Mexico City, directly on top of the ruin. The sacred precinct at the heart of Tenochtitlan was taken apart stone by stone. Its materials were reused in the construction of the new colonial city. The remains of the Templo Mayor disappeared beneath the streets and buildings, rising beside the new cathedral. Many painted books called codices, containing history, ritual knowledge, tribute records, and other forms of learning, were destroyed. Warfare, conquest, and Spanish religious campaigns destroyed enormous numbers of indigenous books and sacred objects. A heartbreakingly small number of pre-Columbian Mesoamerican manuscripts survived. The loss of knowledge was immense. Entire systems of history, astronomy, ritual, medicine, law, and poetry reduced to ash. Try to imagine that. An entire library, an entire way of understanding the world, gone. But even in the darkest years of the colonial period, some indigenous scribes continued producing important documents, preserving fragments of what had existed. Their determination to record and remember meant that not everything was lost. Nahuatl survived, but the institutions that had sustained Mexica power and education were dismantled or transformed. During much of the colonial era, Nahuatl remained widely spoken and was even used in missionary work, legal documents, and official records. Over centuries, Spanish became dominant. Yet now our communities continued speaking, adapting, and writing their language. It was never truly extinguished. The calendar system and the traditional social structures were suppressed or changed beyond recognition. The population of central Mexico, which may have been as high as 25 million people before the conquest, collapsed catastrophically due to disease, violence, and forced labor. By some estimates, by 1600, the population had fallen by 80 or 90%. It was one of the greatest demographic disasters in human history. Chapter 13. What remains? And yet, the story does not end there, because stories never truly end. They transform. In 1978, electrical workers digging near the historic center of Mexico City accidentally struck a buried stone with their equipment. Archaeologists were called in. What they uncovered was a massive circular stone depicting Coyolxauhqui, the dismembered moon goddess. Buried for centuries near the remains of the Templo Mayor, it opened the way for one of Mexico's most important archaeological excavations. Nahuatl never died. Today, more than 1.5 million people still speak varieties of it in Mexico. Words from Nahuatl have entered the English language, words you use every day. Chocolate, avocado, tomato, chili, coyote. These are Nahuatl words. Every time you bite into an avocado or drink a cup of hot chocolate, you are, without knowing it, speaking the language of the Aztecs. They are still here, still feeding you, still speaking. The eagle that appears on the Mexican flag today, standing on a cactus, holding a serpent, is the same sacred image preserved in the Mexica founding tradition. 700 years later, that founding vision still defines a nation. The wanderers found their home. And even after everything, even after the guns and the disease and the fire, their symbol survived, their story survived. That eagle is still flying. A final reflection. As we come to the end of this story, I want to leave you with something to carry with you. Not a fact, but a feeling. The Aztecs lived in what they believed was the fifth and present age of the world. They knew it would end. They knew that jade shatters, that gold breaks, that even the brightest feathers wither. And yet they built. They planted gardens on water. They mapped the stars. They wrote poetry. They searched for meaning. That is not a story about the past. That is a story about being human. We all live under an uncertain sky. We all build things that will eventually crumble. We all love people we will one day lose. The Aztecs looked directly at that truth, at the fragility and the brevity of everything, and they responded with color and discipline and devotion and flower and song. Their answer to the darkness was beauty. Their answer to impermanence was to create. Perhaps that is the question the Aztecs leave us with. In the face of everything that is uncertain and fragile and brief in your own life, what are you building? What is your flower and song? What is the city you are constructing, stone by stone in the middle of the lake? The fifth sun is still burning, and you are still here in its light. Use it well. The Aztecs spoke of in Xochitl, in Cuicatl, flower and song. The beauty and meaning we create while we are still alive. What is your flower and song? We would love to know. Share your answer in the comments. Thank you for listening to English Through Great Stories. If this episode moved you, challenged you, or helped you grow in your English, share it with someone who loves great stories. We'll see you in the next episode. Keep learning, keep exploring, and keep listening.